Welcome everyone to Behind the Scenes of Policymaking, the science, influence, and how change really happens. Let's take a quick look at how this training is structured. We have 4 sessions in total. So session 1 focuses on providing an overview of the tactics used by those engaged in policymaking who are influencers but not decision makers. Session 2 will cover grassroots efforts, political movements driven by ordinary constituents within a community. Session 3 covers grass top efforts. That's almost the opposite of grassroots efforts, which focuses on influencing decision makers through small groups of highly influential people. And session 4 covers how coalitions of interested parties work together to inform legislation and what other aspects of the issue also contribute to the final policy decision. We will bring in insights from current policy practitioners. We'll hear from those who are working in the policy world, government relations staff, and lobbyists who have portfolios relevant to scientific and technological issues. And all 4 sessions are designed to help you identify how to engage with the policymaking process strategically and realistically. And that's our ultimate goal. So I just want to assure you, you're in good hands with a team of training leaders who have a wealth of experience in the practice of policymaking at the state and federal level, with activating community members and top-level executives. All 4 of us will teach and lead different sections of the training, as well as respond to your questions in the Zoom Q&A or chat. So I'm T'Pring Pequado. I'm the CEO of National Science Policy Network. Tomorrow, Justin Ryan will go over session 2. He's a government relations and associate at the Association of American Universities. The next session, session 3, will be led by Jarrett Caitlin. He's founder and public affairs consultant at Caitlin Strategies. And session 4 will be led by Don Kopke, partner at McHugh, Kopke, and Padron Government Relations. So just a little bit of background about me. I have over 2 decades of experience as a neuroscientist, policy researcher, and director of government relations, lobbyist, and science advisor. My work bridges the world of science, technology, and public policy. As you likely know, I'm currently the CEO of National Science Policy Network, where I have the pleasure of building capacity in the next generation of researchers like you engaging in policymaking, connecting scientists with opportunities to inform policymaking, and convening policymakers, researchers, and the public to solve our most pressing issues. I actually started focusing on using my science perspective in policymaking many years ago when I was a California Council on Science and Technology Science Policy Fellow. I was placed in the California Senate Human Services Committee. I contributed to the development of policy solutions on a range of complex issues since then, including housing, recycling and materials management, technology infrastructure, public access to news and journalism. And I've held senior roles in policy engagement, including Chief Policy Director at the California Issues Forum and Senior Director of Government Relations for Western States at the Chamber of Progress. And at RAND Corporation, I led research projects supporting evidence-informed decisions at every level of government and taught ethics and policy design and policy and action at the RAND Graduate School of Public Policy. I earned my PhD in neuroscience from Brandeis University and my BS in computer science, totally different, from Georgetown University. My research portfolio includes work on traumatic brain injury, emerging technologies, human-machine systems, DNA sequencing, military and veteran workforce transitions, and as you can tell, it spans a variety of topics. My career reflects really a deep commitment to integrating science into the policymaking process to improve the public outcomes and promote equitable, data-driven governance. So today I'm speaking to you as an overarching discussion about policymaking behind the scenes. Policymaking is ideally about solving a societal problem, starting with a goal that becomes more clear over time, identifying a strategic direction, and then selecting the tactics to get there. But in practice, it rarely flows in a straight line. Often the strategy has to evolve as conditions shift, public opinion changes, new data emerges, or political windows open or close. The real challenge isn't just choosing the right tactic, it's knowing when a tactic will work, who it will work on, and when's the right moment. You might have the perfect policy solution, but if it's the wrong time or during a budget fight, an election year, or a scandal, your tactic may fall flat. That's why political timing, narrative framing, and coalition building matter just as much as the underlying evidence or intent. The most effective policy actors, including scientists, are the ones who stay flexible. They watch the entire ecosystem, spot opportunities, and adapt their tactics accordingly. So when we think about how government makes decisions, it's important to recognize the public-facing processes. This is what I call in front of the scenes, the moments where transparency, access, and participation are not just allowed, but encouraged. These include the public comments or testimonies, whether written or spoken. These are opportunities for individuals, including us researchers and advocates, to formally weigh in on proposed rules and regulations or legislations. These comments become part of the public record and can shape how these comments become part of the public record and can shape how policies are written or revised. So legislative deliberations are when bills are discussed in the committee, the hearings, the council meetings, the legislative sessions. These are conversations that are always open to the public. A lot of times they're called sunshine laws in various states. This is where you can observe the debate. They're publicly open. Oftentimes they're on TV or at least broadcast on government websites where you can listen in. You can observe the debate, understand the arguments being made, and sometimes even participate yourself through testimony or questions. Public votes, whether it's a city council vote or a state proposition or a legislative roll call, these moments are transparent and documented. They show how decisions are finalized and who supports or opposes them. As researchers or other interested parties, the public forums are the in front of the scenes, in public entry point places where we can insert evidence and elevate community perspectives. They are genuine opportunities to listen carefully, identify policy windows, and build relationships with those in decision-making roles. But there is much more to policymaking that goes on behind the scenes. So that's where I want to dig in today. So researchers often rely on publishing journal articles. It's sort of what we're taught to do and what we get our influence on. These are typically concise, technical, summarizing findings and methods, but they rarely highlight how the work connects to current policy debates. A more direct and effective approach can be scheduling personal meetings or one-on-one briefings with policymakers, engaging legislators or their staff. Face-to-face meetings build trust and helps clearly explain relevant research. Researchers may also be invited to testify at legislative hearings. That's quite fun. These formal settings allow experts to present evidence on specific bills or policy issues. Testimony must be clear, concise, and politically aware. Another common tactic is collaborating with professional societies or advocacy groups that already have policy access. And these partnerships help amplify research through trusted, well-connected intermediaries. And so you'll hear me say trusted a lot, and that's something that should be highlighted and amplified. Trusted, well-connected intermediaries. Some researchers use media platforms like op-eds, policy blogs, or local news to share their insights. And this does help move scientific findings beyond the academic journals and into the public and political conversations. Policymakers and staff often track media coverage to understand emerging concerns. So there are Google alerts now that staffers often flag. And serving on advisory committees or task forces are another impactful way researchers influence decision making. And these groups help shape how evidence is interpreted and applied over time. Finally, there's opportunities to participate in policy fellowships like AAAS or CCST, the California Council on Science and Technology, like I participated in, or other state level programs, which allows researchers to be embedded within government and gain a firsthand experience and influencing decision from within. As this slide reminds us, we have many ways to engage with policy, and savvy science communicators select the right tactics based on their goals, organizational setting, and capacity. But it's still not quite behind the scenes. Evidence alone doesn't drive change. This training is about how sharing evidence is usually insufficient to reach the goal of solving a societal problem through a legislative means. So, evidence doesn't always drive change. When people think about influencing policy, they often imagine testifying in front of the lawmakers or sending a well-crafted report to a government agency that's just going to be picked up and used. But the reality is far more complex and far more strategic. These are some of the most common tactics used behind the scenes by advocates, lobbyists, and other stakeholders who want to shape what government does or doesn't do. And we're going to go through them. Sometimes there are opportunities to influence and win the vote just with the use of evidence, but that is rare. So negotiation remains a classic tool. Negotiation means exchanging support for one issue in return for movement on another. You bend on something that I think is really important. I bend on something that you think is absolutely critical. This is sort of a transactional, but often effective, especially when time or political capital is limited, right? So you can't always get everything you want all at once. Grassroots activation is one of the most visible tools. And I say visible because it involves mobilizing people. That's voters, constituents, sometimes children, or members of a community to call, write, show up in support of an issue. The volume and visibility of public support can send a powerful message to decision makers. And that's what you're going to hear more about and have an opportunity to practice in tomorrow's session. Less visible is the activation of grass tops. And you might not have heard of that term, grass tops. So the opposite of the roots is the tops. So the roots are the power of the people, and the tops are the power of the CEOs or the top level influencers. So think high level CEOs or high level community leaders. Think religious advisors or large networks like American Red Cross or Planned Parenthood, or even NRA, or tobacco and oil or pharmaceuticals, things like that, that are the top level tech CEOs that can speak directly with policymakers and send a powerful signal to what their thoughts are on issues. Another tactic that's used is earned media and paid media. So some groups turn to paid media to shape public opinion, and this is through ads on TV, social media, or digital platforms. And you're going to hear more about this in the third session. There's opportunities to build name recognition for their cause, frame the debate in their favor, and often reach voters or policy decision makers directly. But there's also this opportunity to rely on earned media. This is not paid for. This is where journalists cover an issue organically through op-eds, news stories, or interviews. A single well-timed media hit can catapult an issue into the public consciousness and create pressure for action. So remember, sometimes having a well-framed story of an individual can evoke that storytelling empathy that really does spark change. And that is a tactic used behind the scenes. Then there's the silver bullet tactic. This is very rarely seen in practice, but it is possible. If you can identify the one fact, it's usually a coalition of people that can identify the one fact that's a story or an angle that makes it politically toxic to oppose your cause. It might be a moral argument or a personal testimony or a viral image. Whatever turns public opinion sharply in a direction, it could change to win the vote. One example of that was when there was a viral image of a dress where some people saw the dress as being white and brown, and other people, a minority of people, saw it being black and blue. And there was a domestic violence campaign that was put out. Since the minority of people could see the black and blue, they put a woman who had been clearly injured in domestic violence, and the caption read, "Why is it so hard to see black and blue?" Right? And so it was leveraging this moment in time where um, everyone was sort of debating, is the dress black and blue, or is the dress white and brown? And it was a visual um, imagery portion. So some policy changes don't need the spotlight at all. There are some tactics that actually are so behind the scenes that it's called hiding it in the budget. You're going to hear a little bit more about the budget in session 2. But this strategy is about embedding language or funding opportunities into a larger budget bill and allowing it to pass quietly without drawing opposition. In most states and most federal bills, the budget bills are quite large, or there are multiple budget bills. And so hiding it in the budget can be an extremely successful tactic for some items or for some issues. When pressure alone isn't enough, groups may threaten to pursue action at the ballot box. And what that means is using initiatives or propositions to bypass the legislature entirely. Even the threat of a well-funded ballot measure, sometimes called questions in other states like Massachusetts, or initiatives, can force lawmakers or negotiating groups to come to the table. So that's another one, ballot box threat. And of course, old-fashioned money still plays a role. And what I mean by money is the idea of using campaign contributions to gain access to elected officials, lobbying networks, and paying for access to exclusive events to build relationships and trust with decision makers, to continue to influence which issues rise to the top and which ones are quietly ignored. In policymaking, influence is not about one strategy. It's about knowing which lever to pull, when, and with whom. And savvy influencers, including researchers, can learn from these approaches to advance evidence-informed solutions in a scientifically, policy, and politically strategic way. So I'm going to say that again. Evidence-informed solutions in a scientifically, policy, and politically strategic way. But it's not over just because it gets a yes vote in the legislature. So let's say your issue got a yes vote. It's more or less what you wanted. There's an opportunity still for it not to be implemented to solve that societal problem in the way that you intended. Or if you didn't want it to pass, there's still a way post legislature to influence the way it gets implemented. And there are two major ways. So passing a law isn't the end of the policymaking process, and often legislation leads to litigation. So after legislation is enacted, there are key opportunities to shape how that law is interpreted, implemented, and enforced. It's oftentimes called the regulatory influence or the regulatory agencies, and they're responsible for writing the rules and regulations that bring the laws to life, the details of the laws, of the legislation. And stakeholders or policy actors, including researchers, can have an important influence on this process. So by submitting comments, it's called public comments, attending hearings, and engaging directly with regulators, there's a real opportunity to impact the implementation of legislation. And then there's also the legal pressure. This is where scientists and lawyers can come together, and the courts offer another avenue for shaping policy outcomes through lawsuits, injunctions, legal advocacy. Individuals or organizations can challenge how law is applied or interpreted, or even argued that law is unconstitutional or conflicts with existing rights. And these policy decisions determine how laws actually affect people. I do see that there are comments, and I'll get to them in just 3 more slides. I want to discuss a real life example, and then we'll get to a lot of the questions because I know there are a lot of questions about the details. So let's discuss a real life example when these tactics really come into play in practice. So in the mid 1980s in California, recycling looked like the next big thing. There was a garbage barge floating off the Atlantic coast for months in search of a place to dump its cargo. It drew an international attention to the cause. Landfills were filling up and shutting down. Kids and older adults and lots of people in between were talking about what they could do to reduce, reuse, recycle. And this is an example of grassroots, paid media, and earned media influencing policymaking. So there was also evidence that behavioral change research that showed when you raise the price of bottles, those recycling bottles, and you offer a deposit for a refund for returning it, people would change their behavior and increase recycling. So there was actually evidence, okay? So in California, an environmental nonprofit called Californians Against Waste hired an early career advocate named Mark Murray, whose career led him to be one of the most knowledgeable figures on waste prevention and recycling management. In 1986, the California legislature, in 1987, the California legislature passed the state's first bottle recycling bill, requiring deposits and refunds on soda, beer, and carbonated water. So soda bottles, beer bottles, and carbonated water bottles. But not all beverage containers were included, specifically not wine bottles. Okay, not wine bottles. Wine bottles are made out of glass that's very easily recyclable. And you can, in the QR code right there, you can find a link to a full 4-part series on Mark Murray and recycling titled The Shadow Legislature. And it's written by Daniel Weintraub in the Orange County Register. It's absolutely fascinating and goes through this entire story with great detail. And it'll give you a lot of behind the scenes of recycling in California. And I will add the link when I am done with the presentation. Okay, so the wine industry used its clout to gain an exemption for its wine bottles, including wine coolers. The wineries, like most other beverage makers, absolutely opposed anything that added a cost to consumers at the checkout line, which doesn't seem very unreasonable, right? So, as a concept, don't add cost to consumers. Don't add 5 cents only to ask them to come back to get their 5 cents later. So, the early career advocate, Mark Murray, he's a government relations person, was told that the legislature will never cross the wine industry because they are too dependent on the money wineries contribute to their campaigns. The only way to win is to get the wineries to back down. So proponents, that's the people that want the bottle bill, that want the 5 cent tax or the deposit enacted, decide that the tactic they're going to use is sort of a grassroots individual strategy, individual cities to enact a deposit. So they're going to take it individual city in California by individual city in California and eventually get all the cities across California to enact the deposit for wine coolers in their cities. So they were successful at getting a lot of individual cities to enact a deposit, to require a deposit on wine coolers. So the next year, in 1988, the legislature did enact a bottle deposit on wine coolers because wine coolers were not quite wine. They were a little bit like soda, fizzier with a little bit of alcohol. And so to make it the entire state uniform and not have it city by city, sort of unequal for each city, the state legislature said, okay, okay. The wine industry said, okay, okay. We don't want it to have different across different jurisdictions. The wineries said, okay, we'll allow a deposit tax, deposit cost to consumers on wine coolers. So the lead advocate, Mark Murray, knew it looked like a victory. And it seems like a victory, right? We added another deposit at checkout. It's evidence-based. We know that behavior changes. People recycle more when there's a refund at the checkout. When they cost more at checkout and they get a refund, people return their bottles, whether it's aluminum, glass, plastic, right? So it's evidence-based, evidence-informed, changes behavior. Let's add in at least wine coolers. Although juice boxes for the kids was exempted and wine bottles were still exempted. So the little guys beat big wine. But it wasn't really a David and Goliath story. The whole campaign, going city to city to get them to pass bottle deposit bills in their city, was paid for by donations from Coors and Anheuser-Busch. The model ordinances the advocates shopped to the cities were written by the beer industry lawyers. Big breweries helped out because their beer bottles and their beer cans already carried a deposit. And they didn't want their competition, the wine coolers, getting a free ride. And unfortunately for Mark Murray and the Recycling Coalition, wine coolers in 1988 would be the last beverage containers added to the recycling program for the deposits. The lead advocate, Mark Murray, would try for over a decade to convince the legislature to expand the program with no luck. So this is an example of how multiple tactics were used, and there are more details that you can read in the four-part series about influence and term limits and legislative decision-making, and lobbyists and money play a role in decision-making. And it demonstrates how complex policymaking and engagement can be, even when the evidence for behavioral change is clear. If you raise the price of bottles at the checkout, offer a deposit and a refund, it changes behavior and increases recycling practices. Evidence alone is not enough to have a legislative change. So all of that is behind the scenes of what was done and negotiated and the tactics used. And so now let's discuss. Okay, so the first question is, can you give some examples of these regulatory groups? So regulatory groups are often energy is a huge regulatory group, air resources boards, education boards, um, uh, let's see, Department of Transportation's regulatory group. So anything that you can think of that goes into a law, toxic substances, anything that's an agent, health and human services or health services, human services, the details, once they're created, goes into the regulatory bodies. So if you think of an agency, it's essentially a regulatory group, and they create the laws behind the legislative bills. And if you think about where you might want your um, scientific communicative role, it may be more comfortable in the regulatory bodies, because that's oftentimes where you can be pretty pure in your science, and say, this changes behavior in one direction, this changes behavior, quantitatively larger if you increase it by 2 cents versus 3 cents in our experimental, analysis or our literature review, things like that. Or when Dawn Kopke does her presentation, she'll share a little bit about the scientific evidence that informed PFAS legislation, and there was evidence that was provided for the legislature, but there's also even more um, evidence that's being integrated into the regulatory process as well. So what questions do you have on really how behind the scenes, much of what you see in the testimony and the public comment, that's in front of the scenes. And then 90% of the work is done behind the scenes. So the meetings before the meeting, kind of, thinking about the Hamilton story is like in the room where it happens, right? The negotiations, the one-on-one conversations, the late nights, it used to be sort of like thinking like the golf courses or the dark, smoky rooms with cigars and whiskeys. But, while those are not totally off the mark, I think that a lot of it's gone into like receptions and, afternoon lunches, or late lunches, things like that. But they still do exist because, having access to legislators, and being able to have a conversation with them and building trust and having them know that you understand the topics and you understand them and their constituents is really important for policymaking. And it's not necessarily the role that you have to take as a scientist, and it may not be something that you're comfortable doing as like an honest broker or knowledge translator or knowledge broker, but it is something that is going behind the scenes. So I wanted to start this series because I wanted to sort of demystify the process that putting research in an article and publishing our article, even though it's peer reviewed and it's factually true and correct, isn't always going to be picked up and utilized in a substantive way by elected officials and their staff to influence their policymaking decision. It can be, but you have to do all these other tactics and join all these other coalitions. And you'll hear more about the tactics and coalitions and practice that you can use for your science and your engagement processes. Grace says, Grace, do you want to come on?
Hi, yeah, sure. Thank you. This was a great overview of the many different levers of policy. Really interesting to think through all these aspects. I think for me, I just finished my PhD, and so much of my research has been working alone at my desk. And so getting out there and building the bridges with policymakers, and not just policymakers, but people who work in my field that have been trying to work on these policy levers and these different ways of getting these ideas out there, like you've been talking about, is great, but it's been really a lot of effort for me to try to build those networks and to meet people outside of academia that are working on these issues. So I'm just curious, and if you have any advice for how to bridge that gap and build some of those networks.
Can you tell me at the highest level what the issue you're working on? What's the major societal problem?
So I work on refugee resettlement. So it is a big political issue right now. Yeah.
Great. So, that I would look in your state, go cause IQ, and then the name of your state, refugee, and a trade association. So the state is the only variable, right? Refugee trade association, and up will pop probably the name of the immigration lawyers. There might also be the Civil Justice Association that you can reach out to in your state, and they will have the names of the people. So it's really just like going down a rabbit hole. So you need to find, so Civil Justice Association will know the names of all the lawyer groups. And then they will probably know one that has your particular refugee group, but really sort of that's kind of how I do it. So if you said something more on education, I would say, okay, go to the trade association that's on education. If you said medical, I would say go to the medical association. If you said technology, I would say go to TechNet association. And then they would get you the fine grain specific, like down to the nail technicians, down to the strawberry growers, down to the almond growers, down to the um, uh, there's a single widget that's a fascinator that goes into planes, and it's like this one little piece of fascinators that it's like a whole manufacturing plant that's in Carson, California, right? And so you can get down to like that granular level, but you probably can start at your level, 1 year out of your PhD at the top level association. And you can also start from your professional society. So Society of X, and they have a policy. Your largest society has a policy arm now, and they can help start getting you networked and where you can go. And then you narrow it down to, my specific science is neurobiology of language, particularly in older and younger adults with mild to moderate hearing disabilities. And there are like 30 of us that study that. Neurobiology of language, there are like 500 of us that study it. Aging, there are like thousands of us. And Society for Neuroscience, there's like 50,000, right? So that's sort of the way that I do it. And then the other way that you do it is I'm focused more on states now, just because of the way our federal government um, is right now. We do know in measurement of bills being passed that the number of bills being passed in more recent years has diminished federally. It is increasing statewide. So I suggest starting state-based and going into your state, looking at your state websites and learning your state processes, your state timelines. You learn a little bit about budget on the federal level, which you can apply to the state level, but really knowing your timelines and where you can play a role and learning about that and learning the government relations, the top people in government relations. There's a lot of times, there are like 50 top ones in the state of Nevada. Like that's it. There are 50 people. So if you wanted to work there, you start to know those 50 people, right? It's like for me, I went to school and I had graduated with 25 high school students. So it's like double my high school, right? I can do that. So, and it's really that. It's really starting to like know the players, right? So you can do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me go back up to some questions. Samia, you want to jump on and ask yours?
Sure. Thank you for the talk and the question answers. One of the things I'm curious about is essentially how much of this behind the scenes work needs to be done physically in the DC area. I'm located in the greater Chicago area, and I'm just curious if there are virtual meetings possible, or um, so you were talking about the state-based work that can be done. I was just curious about how people across the state and within DC, I mean, get to
Yeah.
interact, or if they do at all, and what it
Good
looks like.
question. So, if you want federal, you're gonna probably have to move to DC. Just a lot. I would say elected officials are in large part extroverts. And there's just something in the military. I did a lot of research with military health, and there's this term in recruiting where you sit knee to knee. And there's just something about seeing someone eye to eye, breaking bread with them, sitting down for a meal, that you build trust, you build a relationship. And so much of the work is done with body language that just can't even be done via Zoom. It's better, but much of the work is done in person, just dropping by, hey, how's it going? Casual contact, right? So if you want to be a DC government relations science policy practitioner, you're probably going to have to move to DC or surrounding area. However, if you want to be a state-based person, or a regional person, there are a lot of remote opportunities. And Springfield is your state capital, and so there are many people live in Chicago, um, and commute to Springfield, especially during like your legislative session. There's like a train out there. Um, but much of the work is done in Springfield unless you're talking remotely, and you have a strong state government. So you could also think about the role of your cities, and think about how you can impact policies there. And I have a California bias. I live in California. I'm from California. But I can easily switch it to like where California leads, and you have a lot of strong historical representatives, in a lot of different dimensions. Uh, you can do a lot of great work there. So I would just say get involved, and if you want to stay local, if you want to stay where you are regionally bound, start local and go to your city council. City councils are very interesting because it matters more what the constituents say. So grassroots activities matter. So putting something on the paid media as a being on a naughty list, getting an F on a like a report card really impacts them. But yeah, in person is really important. So Nahom, do you want to pop up your question?
Thanks, T'Pring. Um, my question is trying to see about the process or kind of the evolution of science-informed um, policy recommendations and how to engage with the behind-the-scenes negotiations, since that's like the majority of what takes place. Is there any kind of a window
Right.
of opportunity to, is it only if you get in early where you get to almost more purely play with the science informed portion of this? If I
Yeah,
wasn't there in 1987 in California to help out,
mhm.
which I would have been too young to do.
Right.
Um,
Is it
but
over for you? No more
yeah.
helping with recycling. Fortunately, recycling continues to be a California topic, which is why I anchored our real life experience in that. You're going to hear a little bit more about coalition building from Dawn about that. I worked on recycling also. Oregon is worked on recycling a couple years ago. So this is where you need to learn your state-based timelines. It's also because in states, usually on 2-year cycles, states have a legislative deadline. So in California, almost always it's like the third week of February. All the bills in the first year of a 2-year cycle have to be introduced, at least the topic. They call it intent language. It tells the topic. So it might say, we have an intent to fix the recycling and waste management. And so that's when you go to the associations, the big players, maybe the waste haulers, the waste producers. You might go to the green energy. So you start to know the coalitions, so you can start to be available for when the evidence is needed. The other part of it is you start to learn the committee consultants in your state. So you're probably going to be more in touch with, more aligned with only a couple of committees in your state. So for me, I'm pretty much only, my specialty now, just because of the work that I've done, is housing, maybe slightly banking, particularly in crypto, and health, but very small slice of health, not all of health. So I know 3 people in those ones. And I kind of keep track of all those bills just because I find it interesting. And if I want to be helpful, I touch base with those consultants and I'm like, hey, this is popping up. I didn't know that you guys were going to be looking at um, new litigation eligibility or criteria on housing this year. I did a literature review on this. Can I help you, behind the scenes, provide you a knowledge on that, right? I don't need any credit. I'm doing this on my own. This is really interesting. I also do that on, I have a little consulting job, and I did that on the role of Black journalists in the state of California and their impact on the Black community and more broadly, like ethnic media. And so that was behind the scenes. I produced a report, and that was used for whatever it was used on to increase the role of Black journalists in California when it was going through like a big journalism debate. So I think that those are the 2 areas where if you want to get ahead of it, you would be reading and touching base with them in the beginning of the timeline. So oftentimes, like in California, the big debate this year, which we already knew a year ago was going to be cap and trade. We actually knew it 10 years ago because it was a 10-year bill and they were going to have to start revisiting and thinking about it. So if you were an energy researcher, you could have been gearing up to provide evidence. And you would, if you were an energy researcher across the nation, you can start to learn those things. And there are other things like that too. So keep track of the committees, the topics, and the, okay. Mesley? Measley?
Leslie, yes.
Measley.
Thank you for the presentation. I work at Regional Planning Council, so
Cool.
we convene local governments and a lot of those regulatory agencies. So we already have them at the table a lot of the time, and we try to provide like the science-based information and bring in those actors too.
Yeah.
What I'm really interested in is how you find where the issue is stuck. Because I
Mm.
don't know. I'm not as involved with like state legislature and federal, but in the local, even at the local level, it can be very hard to navigate like the local ordinances and see what's really going on between the lines, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you have any recommendations for that.
Yeah, this is going to be a very good question to ask Jarrett and Dawn. So remember that in session 3 and 4. Um, it's not always clear what people want to negotiate. So sometimes in this dilemma, people aren't forthcoming, right? Because sometimes people have different strategies of, if I tell you that I'm really not liking the arbitration agreement, then I think you're going to use it against me, right? And you're just going to, put that on the ballot box and enshrine it in law forever and ever, only to be taken up by the people again. So this is where relationships matter a lot. And if you already have convening power, then your organization can be a real keystone, real key player in trying to broker those conversations to understand where the sticking point is. And Jarrett will go over this sort of when you look at a bill, sort of like the top 3 or 4 issues you look at. But some of the sticking points that I evaluate when I'm doing analysis are, is it hard numbers? Like, are you stuck in it? Can companies predict the consequences of this bill, right? If it's not predictable, companies can't predict risk. Prediction or no surprises is more important than the cost of things a lot of times. So big companies like Google would rather pay 100 million than a variable of 100,000 or 200 million. 0 or 200 million, right? Like the variability is really stressful for a company rather than just tell me I have to pay 50 million for the next 10 years. At least I can predict that. I can generate revenue. I can set my cost prices, things like that. So predictability is something that I always look for. On ramps and off ramps, what's my eligibility for my criteria, and then the impact on small businesses and or vulnerable populations. So I don't know if that's universal for city dilemmas, but those are some of the things that I look at for overarching bill analyses when I'm looking at the companies and politics of things. Okay, Rebecca asked, I'm sure most people who write and try to guide and influence policymaking have good intentions, but one thing that concerns me is the unintended consequences. There is the classic example of subsidizing solar, which ended up on ended up on affluent neighborhood roofs and ended up increasing costs for not affluent electricity ratepayers. How do you balance wanting to make change but knowing that you can't know all the consequences beforehand? So in that consequences in that example, it's actually quite known that you means test bills to do that. So right now in uh, the big beautiful bill is a tax exemption for overtime. That is means tested. If you make over 150,000, you do not get that tax exemption on your overtime. Whether 150,000 is the right point can be arguable. I usually like to argue as a policy practitioner, it should be 400% of the federal poverty rate. Federal poverty rate is set and changes annually. 400% is typically the line at which no federal government or state government aid is allowed for any person. And so it is our arbitrary barometer of whether a person is low income or not. And so things like that. So unintended consequences are oftentimes remedied by another quote unquote bite of the apple and fixed in another iteration. And that's where the stakeholders and the policy actors can rally behind and do small fixes in another legislative year, particularly if it challenged vulnerable populations. So you can't always predict, but that's where the whole ecosystem and the public and a scientist need to come in and really participate to get those consequences to be known, because not all of them are unknown, and you can think about whether it's a feature or a bug, if it's intended or unintended, if it's unknown or not known. But I want to say in the last minute, thank you for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to think about behind the scenes of policymaking. Today was an overview of a variety of tactics, and tomorrow you're going to hear more about the budget, from the federal side, federal practitioner, how you can get involved on a constituent level, and the timeline of the federal, why the budget matters. Then the third session is some really interesting tactics being used in the past. And then the third one is more about coalition building and how evidence informs policymaking and can be used in a very influential way. So I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Thank you.